The courtroom held its breath as Judge Walter Grayson leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a smug smile. His voice, thick with condescension, rang through the room. "Miss Blake, do you have any idea where you are?" His gaze fell upon a teenage girl with unruly curls, clad in a plain hoodie and jeans. Her sneakers let out a faint squeak as she shifted her weight on the polished floor. "This is a court of law, not an audition for some high school debate team." A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Attorneys exchanged smirks, shaking their heads in amusement. At the defendant's table, Sienna Blake stood alone, clutching a stack of legal papers that seemed almost too heavy for her slight frame. A faint blush touched her cheeks, but her hazel eyes remained locked onto the judge, unwavering. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the chuckles around her. "I'm here to—" Judge Grayson cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Spare me. This court does not have time for childish theatrics. Frankly, I don't even understand why this absurdity was allowed in the first place." Sienna lifted her chin. Her voice did not waver. "If you'd allow me to speak, Your Honor, you might find it worth your time." The room fell silent. A teenager standing up to a judge like that? Unheard of. Judge Grayson's smirk hardened into a scowl. "Well, by all means," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Enlighten us." Taking a deep breath, Sienna adjusted the papers in her grip. And then she began. The words that left her mouth turned the courtroom on its head. Citing legal precedents, constitutional clauses, and courtroom procedures with seamless confidence, she wove a compelling argument, one that left the so-called professionals scrambling to take notes. The attorneys, who had laughed moments ago, were now furiously flipping through their files, trying to keep up. Judge Grayson's amusement gave way to something else. Disbelief. A flicker of unease crossed his face. He leaned forward, his voice no longer mocking. "Who are you?" Sienna met his gaze, her lips curling into a small smile. "I'm Sienna Blake," she said, "and I'm here to defend my client." Chaos erupted. Murmurs turned into a cacophony of voices, questions flying from every direction. The judge banged his gavel for order, but even his own composure seemed shaken. How could a teenager command the courtroom like this? Who had allowed it? What in the world was happening? And then, just for a moment, Sienna hesitated. A flicker of doubt crossed her face, barely perceptible, but there, the murmuring died down again. All eyes were on her. Something else was at play here. 2 weeks earlier, Sienna Blake sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by towering stacks of law books and scribbled notes. The books weren't hers. They belonged to her brother Noah, who had been studying for the bar exam. But Noah wasn't around anymore, and Sienna had made it her mission to learn everything he had. Her best friend Harper flopped onto the bed beside her, munching absent-mindedly on a bag of chips. "This is insane, you know that, right?" Sienna didn't look up, eyes scanning a dense page of legal text. "I prefer the word ambitious." Harper snorted. "You're 16, Sienna? 16. People spend years studying this stuff." Sienna's fingers tightened around the book. "I don't have years, Harper. I have now." Harper fell quiet. She'd seen that look before, the one that meant Sienna wasn't backing down, and she knew better than to argue. "You're not a lawyer." Sienna Blake's pen hovered over her notebook, her mind still tangled in the details of a case summary. Across from her, Harper Quinn sat cross-legged on the bed, watching her best friend with a mix of concern and frustration. "Sienna, this isn't a game, you know that, right?" Sienna didn't look up. She flipped through the worn pages of a thick legal textbook, one of Noah's old study guides. Her brow furrowed, her fingers tracing the underlined sections as if searching for reassurance. "I don't care what people think," she said finally. "I have to do this." Harper sighed, shifting her weight, her voice softened. "Why can't you just let it go?" For the first time, Sienna hesitated. She could have said it was because the system had failed, because justice wasn't automatic. It had to be fought for. Because too many innocent people had lost everything to lies and corruption. But that wasn't the real reason. She turned another page, her eyes scanning the dense text. Then, barely above a whisper, she answered, "Because someone has to stand up for the people who can't stand up for themselves." She paused, gripping the book a little tighter, and Noah believed I could do it. Harper didn't argue after that. Instead, she watched in silence as Sienna dove headfirst into the impossible, filling notebooks with legal arguments, memorizing courtroom procedures, preparing for something she had no right to be preparing for. What Sienna didn't tell Harper, what she didn't tell anyone, was that this wasn't just about helping others. It was about proving something to herself. Ever since Noah's death, people had treated her like she was fragile. Teachers, neighbors, even her own parents had started tiptoeing around her, their voices hushed, their hands hesitant, like one wrong word might shatter her. But she wasn't fragile. She wasn't a child. She was smart, she was determined, and she was going to show them all. Back in the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. Judge Walter Grayson, still visibly flustered, leaned back in his chair and studied the teenage girl standing before him. His fingers tapped against the wooden bench. "Miss Blake," he said slowly, his skepticism still present but no longer drenched in mockery, "are you telling me that you are representing the defendant?" Sienna nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." A murmur swept through the room. The prosecution exchanged amused glances. Some reporters in the gallery leaned forward, fingers hovering over their keyboards, ready for whatever ridiculous explanation this girl had prepared. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. "And where exactly did you study law?" Sienna didn't blink. "I didn't go to law school, if that's what you're asking." A few chuckles, someone coughed to hide a laugh, but Sienna's voice remained steady. "I've spent the last year studying legal texts and courtroom procedures. I've read every case related to this matter. I understand the law, and I believe I am qualified to represent my client." Judge Grayson exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You believe you're qualified?" The weight of his words pressed down on the courtroom. Sienna didn't back down. "Then let me prove it." The judge stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth to respond. But before he could speak, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man strode in, tall, impeccably dressed, radiating authority. His charcoal gray suit was flawless, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. The room shifted around him. Attorneys straightened their ties. The bailiff subtly adjusted his stance. This was someone important, someone who mattered. Sienna turned, her confidence flickering for the first time. Who was this man, and what did he want? The courtroom's attention snapped to the man as whispers filled the air. Who was he? Why was he here? Judge Walter Grayson narrowed his eyes, his authority creeping back into his voice. "Excuse me, sir. Who are you, and what business do you have interrupting my courtroom?" The man stopped just before the bench, setting his briefcase down with deliberate precision. His gaze was calm, unreadable. "My apologies, Your Honor." He gave a respectful nod. "My name is Nicholas Hayes, and I'm here as a representative of the Bar Association." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. At the defense table, Sienna Blake's fingers clenched around her stack of notes. Her pulse quickened. Someone from the Bar Association? Was this about her? Judge Grayson arched an eyebrow. The Bar Association, and what interest do they have in this case? Mr. Hayes calmly unlatched his briefcase, pulling out a folder and flipping through the pages. "It's not the case itself, Your Honor. It's the matter of representation." He glanced briefly at Sienna before continuing. "We received an anonymous tip about an unlicensed individual attempting to represent a client in court. Naturally, this is something we take very seriously." The weight of the words settled like a stone in Sienna's stomach. She had fought too hard for this moment. Sleepless nights, relentless studying, memorizing case law until her eyes burned, only for it to be ripped away. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Unlicensed? Well, Mr. Hayes, I'm sure you can see why this is highly irregular. As I was just saying, Miss Blake has no formal legal training. Her presence here is questionable at best." Before Mr. Hayes could respond, Sienna stepped forward. "Your Honor, I understand this is unconventional, but I've done the research. I've prepared for this case as thoroughly as any lawyer would. My client deserves a fair defense." Grayson's smirk widened. "Miss Blake, this is a court of law, not a stage for theatrics. Do you even understand the weight of what you're attempting?" Sienna refused to flinch. "I do, and I also understand that if my client doesn't have someone fighting for them, their life could be destroyed." A hush fell over the room. Even some of the attorneys, who had dismissed her earlier, now watched with a flicker of intrigue. Judge Grayson frowned. visibly irritated by the shift in energy. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat, bringing the attention back to him. Your Honor, while I agree this is highly unusual, the law exists to uphold justice, not to suppress it. Shouldn't Miss Blake at least be heard? The judge exhaled, drumming his fingers against the bench. His frustration was clear, but so was the realization that the courtroom was no longer laughing at Sienna Blake. After a long moment, he sighed. Fine, Ms. Blake, I'll allow you to continue, temporarily. But if I determine you're wasting this court's time, I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear? Sienna's breath caught for just a second. Then she squared her shoulders. Yes, Your Honor. Relief washed over her, but she had no time to celebrate. The real battle had just begun. A year ago, Sienna Blake wasn't a fighter. She was just a teenager who spent her afternoons with Harper, laughing over stupid jokes, scrolling through her phone, living a normal life. But that ended the day her brother Noah was arrested. Noah had been her hero, brilliant, kind, and unstoppable. He was only 2 months away from finishing law school when everything fell apart. One night, he got into an altercation with a wealthy businessman outside a bar. The man claimed Noah had attacked him unprovoked. Noah swore it was self-defense. The justice system didn't care. And Sienna learned firsthand how quickly the truth could be buried. Sienna's parents had tried to help, but they didn't have the resources to hire a powerhouse attorney. The public defender assigned to Noah's case was drowning in other work, barely making an effort in court. In the end, Noah was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Sienna had been shattered, watching her brother, a man who had dedicated his life to justice, become a victim of the very system he believed in had broken something inside her. But she refused to let that be the end of the story. She had devoured every legal book she could find, studying case law until the words blurred together. She wasn't a lawyer, not by title, but she knew the law, and she was going to use it to make things right. Back in the courtroom, Sienna's resolve burned hotter than ever. Her voice was steady, her words precise as she laid out her argument. Her client, a middle-aged man named Mr. Calloway, sat beside her, gripping the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He had been accused of embezzling company funds, a crime he swore he didn't commit. Sienna presented records that showed discrepancies in the company's finances, evidence suggesting someone else had manipulated the books. She cited legal precedents that reinforced her client's right to a thorough investigation. The courtroom listened. Even Judge Grayson, who had been so dismissive of her earlier, now leaned forward, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Sienna felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. But then Nicholas Hayes stood up. Your Honor, he said, his voice smooth, controlled. While Miss Blake's presentation is impressive, it doesn't change the fact that she is not a licensed attorney. Allowing her to continue sets a dangerous precedent. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Grayson's gaze hardened as he turned back to Sienna. Miss Blake, I'll give you one last chance to explain yourself. Who gave you the authority to act as legal counsel in this case? Sienna's pulse thundered in her ears. She had expected this question, rehearsed her answer 100 times. But now, with the weight of the courtroom pressing down on her, doubt crept in. She took a deep breath, ready to respond. Then, the door to the courtroom swung open. This time, it wasn't another suited official. It was a boy, no older than 10, his small frame barely visible between the rows of spectators. Sienna! The boy's voice cut through the silence. She turned, her heart stalling. Ethan, she whispered. The boy ran toward her, gripping a crumpled envelope in his hands. His sneakers squeaked against the polished floor as he rushed past the rows of stunned onlookers. You forgot this, he said breathlessly, holding the envelope out to her. Sienna stared at him, her stomach twisted into a knot. She knew exactly what was inside that envelope, and she had never intended to reveal it. Not here, not like this. But now, with every eye in the room locked onto her, there was no way to avoid it. Judge Grayson's voice cut through the thick silence. Miss Blake, he said, tone sharp, what's in that envelope? Sienna's fingers trembled as she took it from Ethan. The weight of 1,000 eyes pressed down on her. This was it. Whatever was inside had the power to change everything. The envelope contained something Sienna had never intended to reveal. Not here, not in front of a packed courtroom, and certainly not with Judge Grayson watching her every move. But Ethan, in his innocence, had brought it here, and now she had no choice but to face it. Sienna started, but her voice faltered. It's nothing relevant to this case, Your Honor. Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed. Miss Blake, you're already on thin ice. If you're withholding something that could impact these proceedings, I assure you it will not end well for you. Sienna swallowed hard. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, his wide, trusting eyes looking up at her. Show them, Sienna. Her heart sank. Ethan didn't understand what he was asking, but how could she blame him? He was only trying to help. She took a deep breath, glancing at Mr. Calloway, whose face was a mixture of confusion and fear. Sienna's fingers moved to open the envelope, but before she could, Nicholas Hayes spoke again. Your Honor, I believe we are straying from the matter at hand. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Whatever that envelope contains, it does not change the fact that Miss Blake is not a licensed attorney. Allowing her to continue sets a dangerous precedent. Judge Grayson raised a hand, silencing Hayes with a single gesture. I will determine what is relevant here, Mr. Hayes. Tightened her grip on the envelope, feeling as if it had doubled in weight. If she opened it, everything she had worked for could crumble in an instant. If she refused, Judge Grayson would likely hold her in contempt. The entire courtroom held its breath. Miss Blake, Judge Grayson's voice was lower now but full of warning. I won't ask again. Open the envelope. Sienna looked at Ethan, then at Mr. Calloway, then back at the judge. There was no way out. Slowly, she tore open the top of the envelope and pulled out a folded letter, its paper slightly worn, the ink painfully familiar. Her throat tightened the moment she recognized it. It was Noah's handwriting, the last letter her brother had written before he was taken to prison. It wasn't just words on paper. It was a plea, a challenge, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, no matter how impossible it seemed. Sienna's hands trembled as she held the letter, her mind racing. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Judge Grayson's voice was quieter now, almost curious. Sienna hesitated, then folded the letter back into the envelope, tucking it away. It's personal, she said firmly, meeting the judge's gaze without flinching, and it has nothing to do with this case. A heavy silence followed. Judge Grayson watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. Fine, but understand this, Miss Blake. This is your last chance. If there are any more disruptions, I will have no choice but to remove you from this courtroom. Sienna nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She glanced at Ethan and gave him a small, reassuring smile. Thank you. She ruffled his messy hair. Now go sit with Lily, okay? Ethan nodded and hurried back to the back row, where Lily sat watching anxiously. Sienna turned back, ready to continue her argument. But before she could speak, the courtroom doors swung open again. This time, it wasn't a child or a lawyer. It was a woman, tall, commanding, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark blazer. She walked with authority, her sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on Sienna. Your Honor, her voice cut through the silence like a blade. My name is Margaret Steele. I'm with the district attorney's office. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Grayson frowned. Miss Steele, this is highly irregular. What matter could possibly justify interrupting my courtroom? Margaret Steele's gaze did not waver. She looked directly at Sienna, her expression impossible to read. It concerns the unauthorized presence of this individual, she said, gesturing toward Sienna, and the consequences of allowing her to continue. The room exploded in a wave of murmurs. Sienna felt her stomach twist into knots. Steele wasn't here to support her. She was here to tear her down. Order! Judge Grayson's voice thundered as he slammed his gavel down. Miss Steele, you will explain yourself, now. Her piercing gaze, never leaving Sienna. Of course, Your Honor. I've come to inform this court that if Miss Blake is allowed to proceed, it will constitute a serious violation of legal ethics. As a representative of the district attorney's office, it is my duty to ensure that the integrity of this court is upheld. Sienna Blake's heart pounded in her chest. She had fought so hard to get here, and now it felt like the entire system was conspiring to stop her. But she couldn't give up, not when so much was at stake. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her, "I respectfully request the chance to prove myself. I may not have a law degree, but I've done the work. I've studied the law, and I believe I am the best person to defend my client." Judge Walter Grayson observed her carefully, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Victoria Langford, then at Mitchell Carrington, and finally at the packed courtroom. The tension was palpable, everyone holding their breath as they waited for his decision. Finally, he spoke. "I'll allow this hearing to continue," he said firmly. "But Miss Blake, you are on very thin ice. If you falter even once, I won't hesitate to shut this down. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sienna said, relief flooding her voice. But it didn't last long. Victoria Langford stepped forward again, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "In that case, Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness." Sienna's blood ran cold. Witness? What witness? She wasn't prepared for this. As Victoria turned toward the door, the courtroom watched in stunned silence. A man entered. A man Sienna recognized instantly. It was Damien Holloway. Sienna froze, her mind racing. Why was he here? What did he have to do with this case? And what was Victoria Langford planning to do next? The room felt as though all the air had been sucked out. Sienna's stomach twisted as she watched Holloway saunter into the courtroom, dressed in a tailored navy suit, carrying himself with the same arrogance that had haunted her since Noah's trial. His presence wasn't just unexpected. It was a threat. He glanced at her, his lips curling into a smirk that made her skin crawl. Victoria gestured toward him. "Your Honor, this is Mr. Damien Holloway. He is a key witness, and his testimony is crucial to establishing why this court cannot allow Ms. Blake to continue her representation." Sienna's heart pounded as questions raced through her mind. What could Damien Holloway possibly have to say about her? How could Victoria connect him to this case? Judge Grayson frowned. "Mr. Holloway's presence is highly irregular," he said, his tone skeptical. "Explain, Miss Langford, why this man's testimony is relevant to these proceedings." "With respect, Your Honor," Victoria began smoothly, "Mr. Holloway has valuable insight into Ms. Blake's background and motivations. His testimony will reveal the underlying issues that make her unsuitable to act as legal counsel, even in an unconventional capacity." Sienna's palms grew sweaty. This was an ambush. She glanced at Raymond Whitaker, her client, who looked at her with growing unease. She needed to act quickly, but she couldn't show how rattled she was. "Your Honor," Sienna said, stepping forward, "I object to this witness. His testimony has no bearing on the facts of this case." Judge Grayson raised a hand to silence her. "Ms. Blake, I'll decide what's relevant. Mr. Holloway, take the stand." Damien Holloway moved to the witness stand, his smirk never fading. As he was sworn in, Sienna's thoughts raced. She had studied every angle of Whitaker's case. But this was entirely unexpected. She needed to stay focused, but the sight of Holloway, the man who had destroyed her brother's future, made her blood boil. Victoria Langford began her questioning. "Mr. Holloway, can you describe your prior interactions with Ms. Blake?" Holloway's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I first encountered Ms. Blake during her brother's trial. He was convicted of assaulting me after a heated altercation outside a bar. The evidence was clear, and the court found him guilty." The courtroom murmured. Sienna's face burned as she clenched her fists. Holloway wasn't just dredging up the past. He was twisting it to suit his narrative. "And how did Miss Blake behave during that time?" Victoria asked, her voice dripping with false concern. Damien Holloway leaned back in his chair, his tone calculated yet deceptively casual. She was disruptive. He spoke as if he were simply stating facts, but every word carried intent. She showed up to every hearing, glaring at me like I was some kind of villain. Even after the trial was over, she wouldn't let it go. She sent letters, made phone calls, trying to reopen the case. It was obsessive. Sienna Blake stood her ground, her voice controlled but firm. "Your Honor, this has nothing to do with Mr. Whitaker's case. This is a personal attack." Judge Walter Grayson didn't even blink. "Miss Blake, you will have your chance to respond. Sit down." Sienna clenched her jaw but obeyed, though her mind was racing. Holloway's words stung, not because they were entirely false, but because they had been twisted against her. Yes, she had fought for Noah, her brother, after his conviction. She had written letters, she had made calls. But it wasn't out of obsession. It was out of love, out of desperation, out of a need to correct a system that had failed him. Victoria Langford took over, her voice sharp, calculated. Mr. Holloway, in your opinion, does Ms. Blake's behavior during her brother's trial suggest she is fit to represent a client in court? Holloway smirked. Absolutely not. She's too emotional, no respect for the legal system. Allowing her to act as defense counsel is not only inappropriate but dangerous. Sienna gripped the edges of the defense table, forcing herself to stay composed. Holloway wanted her to react. He wanted her to snap, but she couldn't give him that satisfaction. Victoria continued, driving her point home. Your Honor, this testimony clearly demonstrates why Ms. Blake is unfit to continue. Her actions during her brother's trial show a lack of professionalism and objectivity. Sienna shot to her feet. Your Honor, this is absurd. Holloway is not a neutral witness. He's the man who fabricated evidence against my brother. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Grayson slammed his gavel. Order, Miss Blake, control yourself or I will hold you in contempt. Sienna inhaled deeply, forcing herself to remain calm. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, Mr. Holloway's testimony is biased and irrelevant. If this court is truly interested in justice, I respectfully request the opportunity to cross-examine him. The judge hesitated, but finally nodded. Proceed. Sienna stepped forward, her heart hammering, but her voice unwavering. Mr. Holloway, you claim that I was disruptive during my brother's trial. Provide a specific example. Holloway smirked again, as if amused by the challenge. I don't have to. Everyone in that courtroom saw how you behaved. That's not an answer, Sienna replied coolly. If you're going to accuse me, back it up with facts. Otherwise, this is just your opinion, and it holds no weight. For the first time, Holloway's smug expression faltered. Fine, you were argumentative. You refused to accept the court's decision. Sienna tilted her head slightly. So you're saying that because I fought for my brother's innocence, I'm unfit to defend a client? Yes, Holloway said bluntly. You're too emotional. Sienna's eyes narrowed. Too emotional or too unwilling to let people like you manipulate the system? The courtroom gasped. Judge Grayson leaned forward. Miss Blake, watch your tone. Sienna nodded, but her gaze never wavered. Mr. Holloway, let's talk about the evidence in my brother's case, specifically the security footage from the bar. Do you recall why it was never admitted in court? Holloway's expression darkened. It was ruled inadmissible. Why? Sienna pressed, her voice sharp. Was it because it contradicted your claim of assault? Holloway shifted in his seat. I'm not here to discuss your brother's case. Sienna took a step forward. No, you're here to discredit me, but if we're questioning credibility, then let's talk about yours. The tension in the room was suffocating. Holloway opened his mouth to respond. Crash! A loud noise came from the back of the courtroom. Every head turned. A man stood in the doorway, pale, breathless. His hand trembled as he held up a USB drive. His voice shook as he spoke 3 words that sent a ripple through the room. I have evidence. I have evidence that proves everything she's saying is true. The courtroom erupted once more. Sienna Blake felt her pulse hammer in her ears. Who was this man? What did he have? And more importantly, how was it connected to her case? The man in the doorway stumbled forward, gripping the USB drive like it was the only thing keeping him afloat. His wrinkled suit, unkempt hair, and haunted eyes told a story, one of hesitation, fear, and finally a decision that had been made. Judge Walter Grayson slammed his gavel, his voice cutting through the commotion. Order in the court. Identify yourself and explain this disruption. The man exhaled sharply, trying to steady himself. My name is Benjamin Caldwell, he announced, his voice shaking but loud enough for all to hear. I used to work for Damian Holloway. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Holloway's face drained of color. The smug confidence he had worn like armor only moments ago vanished. His chair scraped against the floor as he shot to his feet. Your Honor, I object to this intrusion. This man has no standing here. Judge Grayson narrowed his eyes. Mr. Caldwell, you've interrupted my courtroom. This better be important. Caldwell swallowed, lifting the USB drive higher. Your Honor, I have evidence that contradicts Mr. Holloway's testimony. It's footage. Footage from the night of the incident involving Sienna's brother. Sienna's breath caught in her throat. Footage? Could it be the missing security footage from Noah's trial? The very evidence that had been withheld? Her grip on the defendant's table tightened, knuckles turning white. Holloway's voice rang out, sharp with fury. This is ridiculous. That footage was ruled inadmissible years ago. It's irrelevant now. Caldwell's stance didn't waver. It wasn't inadmissible. It was suppressed by you, Mr. Holloway. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Judge Grayson pounded his gavel repeatedly. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. Sienna's pulse thundered as she locked eyes with Caldwell. She had no idea who he was or why he had chosen this moment to step forward. But she knew one thing. This could change everything. Not just for her client, Raymond Whitaker, but for her brother. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his gaze scrutinizing. Mr. Caldwell, do you have any proof to support these claims? Caldwell nodded, gripping the USB drive. It's all here, Your Honor. The footage, along with records proving it was deliberately hidden. Holloway's jaw clenched, his mask of composure cracking. Your Honor, this man is lying. He's a disgruntled former employee with a personal vendetta. Sienna pushed herself up from her chair, her voice controlled but urgent. Your Honor, if this evidence is genuine, it could prove that my brother was wrongfully convicted, and it could show that Mr. Holloway's testimony in this case is biased and unreliable. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples, frustration clear in his expression. This trial is about Mr. Whitaker, not your brother, Ms. Blake. However, if this evidence calls a key witness's credibility into question, I have no choice but to consider it. Holloway's face darkened. This is a farce. I demand that man be removed and his claims stricken from the record. Judge Grayson didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he turned to the bailiff. Retrieve the drive. Have our IT specialist review it for authenticity. The bailiff approached Caldwell, took the USB, and handed it to the judge before exiting the courtroom. The tension in the air was suffocating. All eyes shifted to Holloway, who was no longer the confident manipulator controlling the narrative. He now looked like a man who had been backed into a corner. Sienna's mind raced. If the footage was real, it could expose Holloway's lies, vindicate Noah, and shift the balance of this entire case. But why now? Why had Caldwell waited until this moment to come forward? She glanced at Whitaker, her client, who was watching the scene unfold with a mix of unease and hope. I'm sorry this is getting so complicated, she murmured. He gave her a small, weary smile. Don't be. You're fighting harder for me than anyone else ever has. Her throat tightened. Whitaker reminded her of Noah, accused, abandoned, fighting against a system that seemed designed to bury him. She wouldn't let it happen again. Time stretched unbearably until finally the bailiff returned, carrying a laptop. He handed it to the judge, his face unreadable. Your Honor, he announced, the footage is authentic. It has not been tampered with. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Judge Grayson nodded, then turned to the bailiff. Play the footage. The laptop screen was adjusted so the courtroom could see. The bailiff clicked play. A grainy black and white video flickered to life. It showed the bar on the night of the altercation. Damian Holloway sat at a table with several associates, laughing and drinking. Moments later, Noah Blake entered the frame, calm, composed. He approached Holloway, exchanged a few words that weren't audible on the footage, then turned to leave. And then, the courtroom collectively froze, because as Noah walked away, it wasn't him who started the fight. Holloway stood up, grabbed his arm, and shoved him. Noah turned, clearly attempting to de-escalate. But Holloway wasn't finished. But Holloway threw the first punch. The fight that followed was brief, but it was undeniable. Holloway was the aggressor. Sienna felt tears burn at the corners of her eyes as she watched the footage. This was it, proof that Noah had acted in self-defense. She turned to look at Holloway, whose face had turned a deep, furious shade of red. The footage ended, and for a long, stretched-out moment, the room was silent. Judge Walter Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Mr. Holloway, he said, his voice ice-cold. Care to explain this? Holloway stammered, his earlier bravado crumbling before everyone's eyes. Your Honor, I don't know what this man is trying to pull, but Judge Grayson cut him off, his voice razor sharp. That's enough. This court will not tolerate perjury or obstruction of justice. He shifted his gaze to Daniel Hayes, the prosecutor, who had remained silent throughout the chaos. Mr. Hayes, I suggest you reconsider the reliability of this witness's testimony. Hayes hesitated, then nodded slowly. Understood, Your Honor. Sienna stepped forward, her voice steady and strong. Your Honor, this evidence not only discredits Mr. Holloway, but also calls into question the integrity of his accusations against my brother. I request that this court proceed with extreme caution regarding his testimony. Judge Grayson gave a slow nod. Duly noted, Miss Blake, but let me remind you, this case is about Mr. Whitaker. Keep your focus on defending your client. Yes, Your Honor, but Sienna's mind was already spinning. If this evidence was allowed into the record, it could do more than just clear Raymond Whitaker's name. It could reopen Noah's case. As the murmurs in the courtroom settled, Miss Charlotte Steele, the sharp-eyed attorney for the prosecution, stood, her expression unreadable. Your Honor, in light of this new development, I'd like to request a brief recess to reevaluate our approach. Judge Grayson exhaled sharply, glancing at the clock. Fine, we'll reconvene in 30 minutes. As the courtroom emptied, Sienna dropped into her seat, her head spinning. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Something told her that Steele and Holloway weren't done yet, and whatever they had planned next, it would be worse. The hum of voices faded as the crowd filtered out, leaving Sienna alone in the courtroom. Her fingers tapped anxiously against the table, her thoughts a tangled web. The footage had shattered Holloway's credibility. It was proof of Noah's innocence. But people like Holloway, they didn't go down without a fight, and Charlotte Steele wasn't the type to give up. A figure slid into the seat beside her, Lily Weston. Behind her, Ethan, eyes wide with excitement. That was insane, Lily whispered, barely containing her disbelief. You totally wrecked him. Sienna managed a faint smile. It's not over yet. Ethan tugged on her sleeve. You're gonna win, right? You're gonna prove them all wrong? Sienna looked at him, her heart aching. She didn't want to make promises she couldn't keep. I'm gonna try my best, Ethan. That's all I can do. The boy nodded, seemingly satisfied. Lily leaned in, lowering her voice. Who was that guy? The one with the USB? Sienna shook her head. I have no idea, but if he hadn't shown up when he did... She trailed off. She didn't want to think about what could have happened. 30 minutes later, the courtroom reconvened. The tension was palpable. Holloway returned, his face carefully neutral, but his posture rigid, his jaw clenched. Miss Steele stood beside him, her sharp, calculating gaze scanning the room. Judge Grayson entered, his gavel striking down. Let's get back to business. Miss Blake, the floor is yours. Sienna rose, her heart pounding. She had prepared relentlessly for this case. But now, the stakes had changed. Holloway's credibility was in shambles, which meant Steele would go on the offensive. She had to be precise. She had to be unshakable. Your Honor, she began, keeping her voice steady. As I've demonstrated, there are significant flaws in the prosecution's case against my client, Mr. Whitaker. The evidence presented so far lacks both credibility and substance. I intend to show that the accusations against him are not only unfounded, but part of a larger effort to scapegoat an innocent man. She laid out her case methodically. Documents, financial records, timelines, each piece unraveling the prosecution's claims. She could feel the weight of the room shifting. Even Judge Grayson nodded occasionally, a flicker of reluctant approval in his gaze. When she finished, Miss Steele stood, her expression cold and unwavering. Your Honor, while Miss Blake's presentation was thorough, it does not absolve her client. In fact, she motioned to a court clerk who handed her a folder. I have additional evidence that solidifies the case against Mr. Whitaker. Sienna's breath hitched as Steele passed the folder to Judge Grayson. His expression darkened as he scanned the contents. Sienna's stomach twisted. She turned to Whitaker, who looked like he'd been punched in the gut. Emails? Sienna asked, her voice sharp. Your Honor, may I review the documents? Judge Grayson handed them over. Sienna flipped through the pages. Her pulse quickened. On the surface, the emails appeared legitimate. Timestamps, headers, company records that aligned perfectly. They painted a damning picture. Whitaker conspiring to siphon funds. But something was off. The language, it was too blunt, too careless. Sienna's grip tightened on the pages as she turned to Steele. Your Honor, I'd like to question the authenticity of these emails. Given the inconsistencies we've already seen in this case, it's not unreasonable to suspect that this evidence may have been fabricated. Miss Steele's eyes narrowed. Are you accusing the prosecution of falsifying evidence, Miss Blake? Sienna kept her voice firm. I'm saying we need to verify the source. If these emails are real, they'll hold up under scrutiny. If not, she let the words hang in the air, the implication crystal clear. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Miss Steele, how were these emails obtained? Miss Steele's response was smooth, practiced. They were provided by an anonymous source within the company. The prosecution has verified their legitimacy. Sienna's jaw tightened. Anonymous source? That's convenient. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request that the emails undergo forensic analysis to confirm their authenticity. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly against the bench, considering. Very well. The court will recess until the emails can be reviewed by an independent forensic expert. For the first time, Steele's composure cracked, just for a split second. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. Sienna caught it, and with it a spark of hope. She wasn't backing down, not now. During the recess, Sienna sat with Raymond Whitaker in a quiet corner of the courthouse. The man looked defeated, his shoulders slumped, hands trembling slightly. I didn't send those emails, he murmured, barely above a whisper. I swear, I didn't. Sienna met his gaze, her voice steady. I believe you, and will prove it. Whitaker exhaled, shaking his head. It doesn't matter. They've already decided I'm guilty. You've seen how they look at me. Sienna reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You're not guilty, and I won't let them railroad you. He hesitated. Then finally he looked at her, really looked at her. You remind me of my daughter, he said softly. She never gave up on anyone either. Sienna's throat tightened. Then I won't give up on you. Hours later, the courtroom reconvened. The tension was electric as a forensic analyst took the witness stand, holding a sealed report. Judge Grayson folded his hands. Have you completed your analysis of the emails? The analyst nodded. Yes, Your Honor, and my findings are conclusive. A beat of silence. The emails in question were forged. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Sienna felt a rush of vindication as she turned toward Miss Steele, whose face was carefully neutral, but her clenched jaw betrayed her fury. Judge Grayson slammed his gavel. This is a serious development. Miss Steele, the court will not tolerate the submission of falsified evidence. You will need to explain how this occurred. Miss Steele opened her mouth to respond, but she never got the chance. Victor Holloway stood abruptly, his face red with fury. He pointed a shaking finger at Sienna. This is all her doing, he shouted. She's manipulating this court to serve her own agenda. Enough. Judge Grayson's voice cracked through the tension like a whip. Mr. Holloway, sit down or I will have you removed. Holloway hesitated, his face twisted with rage, then sank back into his seat, seething. Sienna's pulse thundered in her ears. Something was about to happen. And then it did. The doors to the courtroom swung open. A man stepped inside, tall, hollow-eyed, haunted. He looked straight at Sienna, his face tight with emotion. I need to speak, he said, his voice steady but strained. I'm the one who forged the emails. A beat of silence. Chaos. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, shouts, murmurs of disbelief. Judge Grayson pounded his gavel. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. The man didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, he looked directly at Victor Holloway, then back at the judge. I did it, he said, voice unwavering, because Victor Holloway told me to. Step forward, Judge Grayson commanded, his tone sharp and unyielding. State your name and explain yourself. The man hesitated before taking slow, heavy steps toward the witness stand. His reluctance weighed on every movement. My name is James Holloway, he said, his voice unsteady. I worked for Mr. Victor Holloway. At the defense table, Jalen Dawson sharpened his focus. This was it, the unraveling. Victor Holloway shot to his feet, his face a mask of fury. Your Honor, this man is lying, he barked. He's a disgruntled employee trying to drag me down with baseless accusations. Over. Judge Grayson's eyes flashed with authority. Mr. Holloway, you will sit down and remain silent until it's your turn to speak. Victor's jaw tightened, but under the weight of the judge's glare, he sank back into his chair, his anger radiating off him like heat off pavement. Jalen watched him carefully, his instincts screaming that Holloway was on the verge of losing control. Judge Grayson turned back to the witness. "Mr. Holloway, you've made a serious allegation. I suggest you explain yourself, quickly and clearly." James swallowed hard. "I was hired by Mr. Holloway to falsify those emails," he admitted, his voice cracking. "He told me to make it look like Jalen Dawson was guilty of grand theft auto. He said it was just a necessary step to protect the company's reputation." The courtroom exploded. Judge Grayson's gavel came down hard. "Order! I will not ask again." Jalen's heart pounded. Tate's confession was a bombshell, but it also raised new questions. Why now? What else was Holloway hiding? Judge Grayson narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Holloway, do you have any evidence to support these claims?" James nodded quickly and pulled a small hard drive from his pocket. "Everything's on here," he said. "Emails, instructions, payments, all of it." The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the bailiff retrieved the hard drive. Judge Grayson leaned back, his face unreadable. "This court will review the contents. Until then, we will proceed with extreme caution." Then he turned to Jalen. "Mr. Dawson, do you wish to question this witness?" Jalen stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle onto his shoulders. "Yes, Your Honor." He stepped toward James, keeping his voice steady. "Mr. Holloway, why are you coming forward now?" James hesitated, glancing briefly at Victor before answering. "I couldn't live with it anymore," he admitted. "At first I thought it was just business, just following orders. But then I saw how far it was going, how many people it was hurting. And I have a daughter. I couldn't look her in the eye knowing I'd done something like this." Jalen nodded, his voice firm but measured. "You're saying Mr. Holloway directly instructed you to falsify evidence against me?" "Yes." James's voice was steady now. "He told me exactly what to do and paid me to keep quiet." Jalen took a step closer. "Did he threaten you in any way?" James hesitated, then he nodded. "He said if I didn't do it, he'd ruin me, that I'd never work in this industry again." Jalen turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, this testimony casts significant doubt on the credibility of Mr. Holloway and the prosecution's case. I request that this court take immediate action to ensure Mr. Holloway is held accountable for his actions." Judge Grayson's gaze was cold and unrelenting. "This court takes these allegations very seriously. The evidence on this hard drive will be reviewed promptly." Then his tone hardened. "Mr. Holloway, you are hereby ordered to remain in the courthouse until further notice." Victor Holloway's confident facade cracked. For the first time, Jalen saw it, the flicker of real fear in his eyes. Aftermath, the turning point. As the court recessed to review the evidence, Jalen sat quietly, his mind racing. He had expected resistance, but this? The lengths Holloway had gone to were staggering. And yet, for the first time, the truth was beginning to shine through the cracks. Lisa Thornton, his court-appointed attorney, approached him with a small smirk. "You were incredible in there," she said. "Tate's confession? Total mic drop." Jalen exhaled sharply, exhaustion creeping into his bones. "It's not over yet. The prosecution still has cards to play, and Holloway's not going down without a fight." Lisa gave him a knowing look. "No, but we just made the first move. The final showdown." When the court reconvened, the tension was thick. A forensic analyst returned to the stand, holding a sealed report. Judge Grayson wasted no time. "Have you completed your analysis of the hard drive?" The analyst nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," and the findings are conclusive. A beat of silence. Then, "The data is authentic. It contains a direct trail of emails, payments, and instructions, all linking Vic to the fabricated evidence." The courtroom gasped. Judge Grayson's face was grim as he turned to Holloway. "Mr. Holloway, this court is deeply troubled by the evidence presented. You are hereby detained for further investigation into your conduct." "Bailiffs, take him into custody." A murmur swept through the room as the bailiffs approached Holloway. For a second, he didn't move. Then he shot up, his face contorted in fury. "You'll regret this," he spat, glaring at Jalen. "You think you've won. This isn't over." Jalen met his gaze, unwavering. "No," he said simply, "but it will be." The bailiffs grabbed Holloway's arms, restraining him as they led him toward the exit. And just like that, the courtroom settled. Justice wasn't finished, but for the first time, it felt within reach. Judge Walter Grayson's gaze was sharp as he gestured toward the man hesitating by the witness stand. "Step forward, state your name, and explain yourself." The man swallowed hard before stepping up. "My name is Henry Willis," he said, his voice unsteady. I worked for Victor Holloway." At the defense table, Holloway shot to his feet, face twisted in fury. "Your Honor, this man is lying. He's a disgruntled employee trying to ruin me." Judge Grayson's gavel struck down. "Mr. Holloway, sit down and remain silent." Holloway clenched his jaw but obeyed, though his glare could have burned through steel. Lisa Thornton, the defense attorney, leaned forward, studying Willis. Something about his demeanor told her there was more. "Mr. Willis, you've made a serious allegation. You need to be very clear about what you're saying." Willis nodded, wiping his palms on his jeans. "I was hired to fabricate emails. Holloway told me to make it look like James Reynolds was guilty of fraud. He said it was just business." The courtroom erupted. Judge Grayson hammered his gavel again. "Order! This court will not tolerate outbursts." Lisa's pulse raced. This was huge. But why was Willis speaking up now? "Do you have proof?" Willis reached into his pocket and pulled out a hard drive. "Everything's on here. Emails, payments, instructions." The bailiff took it, handing it to the judge. Grayson studied Willis for a long moment. "This court will review the contents. Until then, we proceed with caution." He turned to Lisa. "Do you wish to question the witness?" Lisa stood, locking eyes with Willis. "Why now? Why come forward?" He exhaled slowly. "I couldn't live with it anymore. I have a daughter. I couldn't look her in the eye knowing I helped destroy an innocent man." "Holloway directly instructed you?" "Yes, paid me to do it, then threatened to ruin me if I spoke." Lisa turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, this destroys the prosecution's case. My client was framed. I request immediate dismissal." The judge took a long breath, then nodded. "The charges against James Reynolds are dismissed." A wave of relief washed over Lisa as the courtroom burst into applause. James sat frozen, barely processing the words. "You're free," she whispered. "It's over." But as Holloway was escorted away, he shot Lisa a cold smirk. "This isn't over," and she knew, deep down, that he meant it. "You shouldn't have come," Henry Willis muttered, eyes scanning the street behind her. "It's not safe." Lisa Thornton stepped closer, voice unwavering. "I don't have a choice. You know things about Holloway, things that could clear James's name." Willis let out a tired sigh. "You don't get it. Holloway's just a piece of the puzzle. There are people behind him, powerful ones. If I talk, I won't be the only one in danger." Lisa didn't flinch. "Then we take them all down, but I can't do that without you." For a moment, Willis just stared at her. Then, shoulders sagging, he nodded. "If we do this, there's no turning back." "I'm ready." Willis stepped aside, letting her into the apartment. "Then let's get to work." Days passed in a blur of late nights and endless documents. Lisa and Willis unraveled a trail of corruption so deep it made her head spin. Every answer led to more questions and more danger. Then, one night, Lisa returned home to find her apartment door slightly open. Her stomach dropped. She nudged the door open, every nerve in her body screaming trap. The place was wrecked, papers scattered, furniture overturned, laptop gone. On the kitchen table, a note sat in bold, jagged letters. "Stay out of this, or else." Lisa exhaled sharply. Holloway wasn't bluffing. Her phone trembled in her grip as she dialed. "Lily," she said, voice tight. "Someone broke into my apartment." "What? Are you okay? Where are you?" Lisa swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'm fine. But they took my laptop." Lily's voice dropped. "Lisa, you need to call the police." Lisa hesitated. "What if that makes things worse?" "You can't handle this alone. Promise me you'll report it." Lisa exhaled. "Okay, I'll call." An hour later, officers surveyed the damage. "Do you have any suspects?" one asked, eyeing the note. Lisa hesitated. "I've been working on a case. Some people don't want the truth coming out." The officer nodded, bagging the note. "We'll investigate. In the meantime, find somewhere else to stay." Lisa barely heard him. This wasn't a warning. It was a challenge. The next morning, Lisa met Willis in a quiet diner. She hadn't told him about the break-in over the phone. Too risky. When she did, his face darkened. "This is exactly what I warned you about," Henry Willis muttered, his voice low. "Holloway's people don't play fair. If they're willing to break into your apartment, they won't stop there." "I'm not scared of them. Jalen Dawson said, though a flicker of doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. We're too close to the truth to stop now. Willis shook his head. You don't get it. It's not just Holloway. There's an entire network behind him. Politicians, corporate execs, even cops. They all have something to lose if we dig too deep. Jalen leaned forward, his eyes burning with resolve. Then we expose them all. We have the hard drive. We know more is out there. If we get enough evidence, they won't be able to silence us. Willis sighed, rubbing his temples. You've got guts, kid, I'll give you that. But guts won't protect you when they decide you're too much of a threat. Jalen thought about the break-in, the invasion of his safe space. He thought about his brother, sitting in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit. He thought about Raymond Whitaker, a man whose life had been nearly ruined. He couldn't walk away. What's the next step? He asked, his voice steady. Willis hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. This is everything I've got on the consulting firm. If we follow the money, we'll find the people pulling the strings. Jalen opened the folder, scanning the contents, bank transfers, invoices, internal memos. A web of corruption began to take shape in his mind. This is huge, he whispered. It's not enough, Willis interrupted. We need hard proof, something that directly ties them to their crimes. Jalen nodded. Then we'll find it. That evening, Jalen returned to his mother Denise's apartment, where he'd decided to stay for safety. She greeted him at the door, concern etched across her face. You look exhausted, she said, pulling him inside. You've been running yourself into the ground. I don't have a choice, Jalen sighed, collapsing onto the couch. If we don't move fast, Holloway and his people will bury everything. Denise sat beside him, handing him a cup of tea. Just promise me you'll be careful. I can't lose you. Jalen gave a faint smile. I promise. A few nights later, it was time to act. Armed with the information from the folder, Jalen and Willis infiltrated an office building owned by the consulting firm. The plan was simple. Find the files, copy them, and get out. The building was quiet, the hum of security cameras barely audible. Emergency lights cast eerie shadows on the walls as Willis led the way to a small server room. This is it, Willis whispered, pulling out a flash drive. Watch the door. Jalen nodded, his heart hammering as he kept an eye on the hallway. Every second stretched into an eternity. Then, got it, Willis breathed, pocketing the drive. Let's go. But as they turned to leave, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Jalen's stomach clenched as two security guards rounded the corner, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Hey, stop right there. They froze. Stay calm, Willis whispered. One of the guards reached for his radio. This is Team A, he said. We've got 2 intruders on the second floor, requesting backup. The second guard stepped forward. Move, both of you. You're coming with us. Jalen's mind raced. If they were taken in, it was over. Fast. Wait, he blurted out, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. We can explain. The guards exchanged skeptical looks. Explain what? You're trespassing. Jalen nodded quickly. You're right, and we'll go with you. But first, you need to see what's on that flash drive. Willis shot him a startled look, but Jalen ignored it. The guards hesitated, caught off guard by his calm demeanor. Listen, Jalen continued. What's on that drive? It might just save your jobs, maybe even your lives, but only if you see it before you call backup. The first guard's flashlight wavered. You've got 2 minutes, he said gruffly. If this is some kind of trick... It's not, Jalen promised. He handed the flash drive to Willis, who inserted it into his laptop with shaking hands. The guards leaned in as the screen flickered to life, revealing a cascade of damning files. Emails detailing bribes, invoices for falsified evidence, and wire transfers leading to offshore accounts. Their faces darkened as they scrolled through the documents. This is real, one of them muttered. Jalen Dawson nodded. That's why we're here. If this gets out, the people behind it will come for us, and for you. But if we work together, we can stop them. The guards exchanged a long, silent look. Finally, the first one sighed. We didn't see you, he said, stepping back, but you need to leave, now. Thank you. Jalen breathed, the relief washing over him. He and Henry Willis packed up fast, the weight of the moment still pressing down on them. As they slipped out of the building, adrenaline surged through Jalen's veins. They had made it out, barely. but what they carried with them could change everything. Back at Denise Dawson's apartment, Jalen and Willis combed through the files in detail. Every document, every transaction painted a clearer picture of the corruption running through Holloway's operations. But as they dug deeper, the truth grew even darker. "This isn't just about Holloway," Willis said grimly. "He's a piece of something much bigger. These accounts, these payments, they connect to major corporations, politicians, even law enforcement." Jalen's stomach twisted. He had expected corruption, but not at this level. "What do we do with this?" "If we go public, they'll come after us." Willis hesitated, then nodded. "We need someone who can protect us and expose this at the same time. Someone with real power." The next day, Jalen reached out to an investigative journalist he had read about in one of his mother's old law books. Her name was Lisa Thornton, a fearless reporter known for bringing down high-profile criminals. Jalen sent her an encrypted message detailing what they had uncovered, asking for a meeting. To his surprise, she responded within hours. They arranged to meet that evening at a quiet cafe downtown. Jalen and Willis arrived early, tension hanging heavy in the air. When Lisa walked in, her presence was undeniable. She wore a leather jacket and carried a laptop bag, her sharp eyes sweeping the room before settling on them. "You must be Jalen," Lisa said as she sat down. "And you're Mr. Willis. Let's see what you've got." Willis handed over the flash drive. Lisa plugged it into her laptop, her expression hardening as she scanned the files. After a long silence, she looked up. "This is massive," she said. "If this is verified, it could take down some of the most powerful people in the country." Jalen nodded. "That's why we need your help. We can't do this alone." Lisa leaned back, thinking, "I can get this out to the public, but you need to be ready for the fallout. They will come after you, hard. Are you prepared for that?" Jalen hesitated, then glanced at Willis. The older man looked exhausted, but there was fire in his eyes. "We're ready," Jalen said. Lisa nodded. "Let's get to work." For the next week, Lisa worked tirelessly to verify the evidence and prepare the story. Jalen and Willis stayed in hiding. Every step forward brought them closer to the truth and closer to danger. One night, as Jalen sat by the window of Denise's apartment, his phone buzzed. A message from Lisa. "It's going live tomorrow. Be ready." Jalen's pulse quickened. Tomorrow, the world would know the truth about Victor Holloway and the web of corruption he had built. But as he stared at the message, unease settled in his chest. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Morning sunlight streamed through the blinds as Jalen sat at the edge of the couch, staring at his phone screen. At exactly 7 a.m., Lisa's article went live across multiple platforms, the headline hitting like a hammer. "The Hidden Web: Corruption, Conspiracy, and the Fight for Justice." Within minutes, the story went viral. News anchors dissected the evidence. Politicians issued frantic statements. Social media exploded in outrage. The article exposed everything: Holloway's criminal empire, the falsified evidence, the consulting firm's shady dealings, and the far-reaching corruption that tainted industries and government alike. Jalen felt a flicker of pride. This was what they had fought for. But the victory was overshadowed by a gnawing sense of dread. They had exposed the truth. Now they had targets on their backs. By noon, Lisa called him. Her voice was urgent. "Jalen, it's a firestorm. The DOJ is launching an investigation. Holloway's people are scrambling, but there's something you need to know." Jalen's grip tightened on the phone. "What is it?" Lisa's voice lowered. "Holloway's gone." A cold chill ran down Jalen's spine. "Gone? How? I thought he was under surveillance." "So did I," Lisa said, frustration clear in her tone. "But someone helped him. I'm digging into it, but you need to be careful. If Holloway's on the run, he might come after you." Jalen swallowed hard. "Thanks for the warning." That evening, the tension in Denise's apartment was thick. Willis paced the living room, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I told you this would happen." "Holloway's too slippery to go down without a fight. He's probably planning his next move right now." Jalen Dawson sat quietly, his mind racing. "He's desperate," he said. "That makes him dangerous, but it also makes him reckless. If he tries something, we'll be ready." "Ready for what?" Henry Willis snapped. You think we can predict his next move? He's got resources, connections. He could do anything. Jalen looked up, his eyes unwavering. We've come too far to back down now. The truth is out there, and people are paying attention. That's what matters. Willis exhaled, running a hand through his hair. The next day, the fallout from Lisa Thornton's exposé rippled through the media. Protests erupted in front of government buildings, with crowds demanding accountability for the corruption exposed in the article. The Justice Department announced the formation of a special task force to investigate the corporations and officials implicated. Jalen watched the news coverage with a mix of hope and unease. The wheels of justice were turning, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. His fears were confirmed that evening. As he and Willis combed through documents at the kitchen table, Denise Dawson burst into the apartment, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said, holding up her phone. Jalen took it, his stomach dropping as he read the message. A warning, sent from an anonymous number. "Get out while you can. They know where you are." "Who sent this?" Jalen asked, his voice tense. "I don't know," Denise said. "It came out of nowhere." Willis stood abruptly. "We need to leave, now." Jalen hesitated. "What if it's a bluff? Do you really want to take that chance?" Willis shot back. Jalen knew he was right. They packed quickly, taking only what was necessary, and slipped out under the cover of darkness. Willis had arranged for them to stay at a safe house owned by an old friend, a small cabin deep in the woods, far from prying eyes. The place was quiet and isolated, but tension filled the air. Jalen spent his days glued to the news, trying to stay ahead of the situation. Willis, on the other hand, kept his phone close, ready to move at a moment's notice. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit living room, Willis finally broke the silence. "Do you ever think about what happens after this?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Jalen looked up from his laptop. "After what?" "After Holloway is gone, after the investigation, after the dust settles." Jalen sighed. "I don't know. I just want Raymond Whitaker to get justice. After that, I haven't really thought about it." Willis nodded, staring off into the distance. "I used to think about it all the time, what life would have been like if I'd never gotten mixed up with Holloway. But now," he trailed off, shaking his head, "now it feels like there's no way out." "There is a way out," Jalen said firmly. "We just have to keep fighting." Willis didn't answer, but the doubt in his eyes lingered. The next morning, Jalen woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. It was Lisa Thornton. "Jalen," she said, her tone urgent. "We've got a lead on Holloway. He's holed up in a private estate outside the city. Word is, he's meeting with his associates to plan his next move." Jalen's heart pounded. "Do you think he's trying to flee the country?" "It's possible," Lisa said. "But we can't let that happen. If he gets away, everything we've worked for could fall apart." "What can we do?" Jalen asked. "I have a contact in law enforcement," Lisa said. "If you're willing to testify about what you know, we might be able to get a warrant to raid the estate." Jalen hesitated. Testifying would put him directly in Holloway's crosshairs, but it might also be the only way to take him down for good. "I'll do it," he said finally. The next few hours passed in a blur. Lisa's contact, a determined federal agent named Detective Daniel Ruiz, met with Jalen to review his statement. By nightfall, a warrant had been issued, and the raid was set for dawn. As Jalen prepared for what was coming, a strange sense of calm settled over him. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let fear stop him. Not now. Not ever. The sun rose slowly the next morning as Jalen stood beside Lisa and Detective Ruiz outside the estate, watching as law enforcement surrounded the property. The air was thick with tension. Every second stretched on like an eternity. Then, with a single command, the raid began. Jalen's breath caught as agents stormed the estate. The sound of shattering glass and shouted orders filled the air. He strained to see what was happening, his heart pounding with anticipation. And then, through the chaos, he saw him. Victor Holloway, handcuffed, furious, dragged out by two federal agents. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Holloway's face twisted with rage, but Jalen stood tall, unflinching. They had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. Not until every last piece of Holloway's corrupt empire was exposed. As the agents loaded Holloway into a waiting police car, the full weight of everything Jalen had fought for crashed down on him. This wasn't just about Holloway. This was about justice, about the truth, and about finally making things right. Later that evening, Jalen Dawson sat in the dimly lit conference room of a federal office, exhausted but resolute. Detective Daniel Ruiz handed him a cup of coffee and offered a small smile. "You did good," he said. "Holloway's in custody, and the evidence you provided is enough to keep him there." Jalen nodded, though he knew the fight wasn't over. "What about his network, the people backing him?" Ruiz's expression turned serious. "We're building a case. The documents you uncovered were a gold mine, but dismantling something this big takes time. It won't be easy, but it's a start." Just then, Lisa Thornton entered the room, her phone in hand and a triumphant look on her face. "The story's everywhere," she announced. "Holloway's arrest is trending on every major platform, public pressure is mounting, and the DOJ has expanded their investigation." For the first time in weeks, Jalen allowed himself a small smile. It's finally happening. The next few days were a whirlwind. News outlets dissected every detail of the case, exposing a web of corruption that stretched further than Jalen had imagined. High-ranking officials were implicated, resignations flooded in, and investigations were launched across multiple industries. The dominoes were falling, and for the first time in his life, Jalen felt a real sense of purpose, knowing he had helped make this happen. But amidst the chaos, his mind kept returning to one name: Raymond Whitaker. With Victor Holloway in custody and the truth about the stolen car evidence exposed, Jalen knew it was time to take the next step. 3 weeks later, Jalen stood outside the courthouse where Raymond Whitaker's appeal hearing was about to begin. He adjusted the blazer he had borrowed from Willis and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He wasn't representing Whitaker in court. That job belonged to a seasoned attorney Lisa had helped connect him with, but he had fought relentlessly to make this day possible. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Jalen sat in the front row, his hands clenched in his lap as the defense presented the newly uncovered evidence, suppressed security footage, forged police reports, and Holloway's role in fabricating the entire case against Whitaker. When it was time for closing arguments, the defense attorney turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the evidence before you is undeniable. My client, Raymond Whitaker, was wrongfully convicted due to a corrupt system designed to protect the powerful. Today, we have the opportunity to correct that injustice." The judge's decision came swiftly. The conviction of Raymond Whitaker is hereby vacated. He is to be released immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by an eruption of cheers. Jalen felt the weight of years of struggle lift from his shoulders. At the defense table, Whitaker turned to him, his face etched with disbelief. Jalen met his gaze, then rushed forward as Whitaker stood, throwing his arms around him in a fierce embrace. "You did it," Whitaker whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You actually did it." Jalen shook his head. "We did it. You believed in me when no one else did. I just returned the favor." In the weeks that followed, Jalen found himself at the center of a storm. Reporters wanted interviews. Legal organizations reached out with offers. Even law schools sent him letters of encouragement. But Jalen's mind was focused on one thing: what came next. One evening, as he and Whitaker sat at a small diner, Jalen finally voiced what had been on his mind. "I want to go to law school," he said. "For real this time. No shortcuts, no courtroom tricks. I want to do this the right way." Whitaker smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "You'll be amazing." Jalen hesitated. "You think so?" Whitaker didn't miss a beat. "I know so. You've already done more than most lawyers ever will." Years later, Jalen Dawson stood in a courtroom once again, this time not as a defendant, not as an outsider, but as an attorney. He thought about everything that had led him here, the battles he had fought, the lessons he had learned about courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what was right. Beside him sat his first official client, a young single mother wrongfully accused of theft. Jalen glanced at the opposing counsel. Then at the judge. He took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and stepped forward. His voice was steady, confident. "Your Honor, I'm here to defend someone who deserves the truth, and I intend to deliver it. And with that, the journey of Jalen Dawson, the young man once mocked and underestimated in a courtroom, came full circle.